finishes, you'll grab 3 pieces of the same fabric, because we'll be doing a seam finish in 3 different ways. Pinked, which is an old home sewing technique. Serged, as you guys have already met with your Chapter 3 samples. And then with a bound edge, which is a more higher end or couture way of finishing, so that way the seams don't unravel. So step 1 for all 3 of these seam samples is to make them into plain seams. Now pinked seams are a cut effect. We use scissors. We have left and we have right versions of them, and they're on the blue trolley for our class stuff. But pinking is a home sewing way of finishing fabric. If you remember from our fabric discussion on Chapter 9, when we cut on the bias, that fabric doesn't fray. When we cut these seam allowances with our pinking shears that are made to have these little jaggedy teeth, each of those teeth have a little 45-degree angle on them. So as we cut, we're pinking each edge and in effect putting a little 45-degree angle on each of those little triangles. So as you prep to cut, you're going to pull all of your layers off to one side to your non-dominant hand, and then you're just going to cut the edge, kind of like when you're serging. You're just trimming off a bit, the fuzzy bits and a little bit more, to make sure that you're getting all of the full triangles. And if you want to be perfectionist, you can always line up your little triangle cuts as you go. And then on the opposite side, you're going to flip the fabric, making sure that all of your excess is still in your non-dominant hand. And then you'll trim down the edge, keeping as much of the seam allowance as possible. Pinking is really helpful if you don't have a serger, and a lot of home sewers don't. If you're working in a costume shop, then yes, there's absolutely going to be a serger, and that tends to be just the most safe or consistent way to finish your seams. But for home sewing, if you want something that will last a little bit longer than a raw seam, pinking is a good way to go. So now that I'm ready to serge my seam allowance, I'm going to make sure that all of my excess is off to the left-hand side and that I'm only using the side that has my seam allowance. So I'll line that up so that the edge is kind of almost on the edge here, the edge of the fabric. Another good indicator is that the presser foot right here should line up with our stitch line. And what's really important to make sure is that you're holding on to the fabrics on the opposite side. You don't want these to accidentally smoosh over and get caught in your serging. So as you're serging, you're watching that you're only feeding one piece in. And just like in Chapter 3, we're going to let the fabric sit and get pulled into the machine while we're working with the chain stitch. And the next side, you'll fold all your excess off to that same left-hand side. You'll place your fabric, making sure that a little fringy bit is hanging off the edge, or that the presser foot here is lined up with your stitch line. This is where having your accurate 5/8 seam allowances is very necessary. And now that you've serged both ends, the last step is just to trim your thread tails close to the fabric edge. And after you've given it one last press, literally that seam is done. Now for a bound seam, we're using a piece of bias tape, which you've actually met this similar stuff. It's what wraps around the cord that you guys were using in your corded seam. So bias tape is bias cut fabric that has been seamed together and then ironed into a fold. And in a further chapter, we'll actually explore making this ourselves. But until then, I'll have you guys use this store-bought, commercially made bias tape. This is called double fold bias tape because you can see it has one fold that everything folds in half, and then one more fold inside each edge. So then that way it's a folded edge that we see when we're finished. You can also probably see that there's a difference in their lengths between the one side that's facing you and the side that's further away from you. And that's the difference of 1/8 of an inch. And what that allows us to do is as we put something onto a surface, if we were to nyam right onto there, just envelope our bias tape onto that edge, can you see on the red how there's a little bit more blue on the back side here than on the front side here? This side has a little bit less than that side. So step 3 is cutting your bias tape to fit. So give yourself a little bit more to work with, and you'll just trim off the ends, and you'll cut 2 pieces the same length. So once you have one the right length, go ahead and use it as a guide for the other. And just like your cording, you'll have a little bit long than you need because we can always trim it off later. When you're working with a bound edge, there's a few different ways to put your binding onto your seam allowance. One way is just to nyam this right onto the edge and try to do it all in one go. But when you're dealing with small things, that can be really fiddlesome. So I'll show you with a few different steps. So step 4 is going to be unfolding our bias and lining up this edge of the bias, the flat fold, with the edge of our seam allowance. And I'm going to pin that perpendicularly through the end. So right now I'm pinning through that fold of the bias tape, and I'm coming up on the inside edge of the seam allowance. And I'm making sure that all of my extra layers are out of the way. And I'll just work my way down, not tugging, just laying it nice and flat. And you can work on a tabletop if this is easier. That gives you a bit of something to work against. But while you're pinning your bias in place, you're making sure that this blue edge is lining up with the edge of your seam allowance. As a stitch that we want to stay, we're going to make sure that our stitch length is on 3 and that our zigzag's on 0. And then we're going to place our sample under the presser foot, making sure that we're lining up this folded edge that we've pinned into, and we're going to use that as our stitch line. So the cut on the presser foot is going to line up with that folded edge. Since this fold is 1/8 of an inch in from the edge, you can also use the inside edge of your presser foot for that 1/8 inch measurement. But to start, I'm going to go forward and then backstitch and then complete this little miniature seam. So now that you've sewn that first step of bias in place, you're going to trim any of these excess tails right here and trim the thread tails from that seam. And now you're going to fold this edge over. So you can start in the middle or start in the ends, but the important thing is you kind of want to smoosh that first seam so that it's nice and flat. And then we're going to fold this end over so that the existing fold of the bias stays right on end. And then I'm just going to pin through the edge of the bias, pivot, and come up through the other side. So right now I'm pinning on the opposite side that I was pinning before. So this is the existing side that we'd already stitched, and I'm still only working on one side of my seam allowance. So to give you guys that context, this is still my seam. I'm just working on this seam allowance. And so I'm folding that edge so that the first stitch line, the raw edge of the fabric, is living inside that bias tape. And I'll pin close to the edge and then pivot into the blue side So then that way it's staying nice and secure. And then when I pin my ends, I'm making sure that I'm not rumpling the fabric. My sheen is still on 0 as a zigzag and on 3 as a straight stitch. And even though I have my sample pinned from this side, because I've pinned perpendicularly, I can flip that sucker and stitch from this side. So write this term down. It's called stitching in the ditch. And it's an industry term that allows us to stitch on an existing seam, but because of the overhang of this piece of blue bias, remember this side was longer, if I stitch in this seam, I will be catching that bias 1/8 of an inch in on that inside edge. So I'll place my seam on the machine so that the presser foot center placement lines up with where the blue meets the red, and then I'll just treat it like a plain seam. I am stitching to start, back stitching, and then completing the stitch all the way down. Just making sure that as I feed it into the machine, that I'm pinching the fabric to make sure that my pins haven't buckled or made things smooshed. So you can see that on this side, I have stitches that are happening right on that stitch line, or maybe I've migrated just a little ways into it. But on this side, I've captured it right 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And now we can finish this little side by trimming our thread tails close to the fabric and by giving it a press, just like the plain seam, a nice light press just to make it nice and clean. So you can see how on one side we have our stitched line, and on the other side is exposed stitching, top stitching, but because it's on the underside of our seam, we'll never see it. And then your last step will be to repeat on the other side.